Sometimes generosity is born of scarcity itself, like flowers that sprout in arid land. Johnny Miller watched the horizon through the cracked window of his cabin. The sun descended relentlessly on the dry fields, turning every grain of sand into small mirrors that reflected his loneliness. His calloused hands held an empty mug, as if he could still taste the last coffee he had drunk 3 days earlier. The surrounding farm seemed to wither under the weight of abandonment. Broken fences stretched out like exposed bones, and the empty corral echoed memories of better times. The only cow he had left, a spotted Holstein he called Belle, grazed near the nearly dry pit. It was all that separated Johnny from complete hunger. That animal represented his last connection with the life he had once known, when Martha was still alive and the farm flourished with promises of prosperity. Now 3 years after losing his wife to fever, Johnny had sold almost everything to pay off debts and buy medicines that arrived too late. The wind brought with it something different that afternoon, not just the familiar smell of dry earth and sage, but a strange, barely noticeable aroma. Johnny frowned and stepped out onto the porch. On the distant horizon, a cloud of dust was slowly approaching. It wasn't the dust kicked up by cattle or lone riders. This was different, broader, more deliberate. As the afternoon progressed, the silhouettes became sharper. A small procession of figures on foot walked towards him. Johnny recognized the signs even before he could distinguish faces. The way they moved, close to each other, their clothes faded by the sun, the absence of horses or carts. They were Indians, and by the way they leaned on each other, they were in a desperate situation. When they finally got close enough, Johnny could see the truth in his eyes. There were 12 people, including men, women, and children. Their clothes were torn, their faces scarred by exhaustion and hunger. An elderly woman carried a small child in her arms, while 2 younger men held up an elder who could barely stand. There was no hostility in his expressions, just the kind of quiet despair Johnny knew well. The leader of the group, a middle-aged man with braided grey hair, approached cautiously. His hands were empty, held up in peace. When he spoke, it was in a mixture of broken English and gestures that Johnny understood perfectly. They had been without food for days. The children cried from hunger. They had seen the smoke from his chimney and were coming to ask for help. Johnny looked at Belle, who was quietly chewing on the scant grass near the well. Then he looked again at the group of relatives. He saw in their eyes the same emptiness he felt in his own stomach, the same uncertainty that kept him awake through the nights. But there was something else in those faces, something he himself had long since lost. Hope, a fragile hope, almost extinguished, but still present. The silence stretched between them like the desert itself. Johnny knew that his decision would define not only his own fate, but also the fate of those people. Belle represented his survival, perhaps his last weeks of life before hunger took him. But looking at the child in the old woman's arms, at the sunken eyes of the other children, Johnny understood something Martha had always tried to teach him, that true wealth is not measured by what we keep, but by what we are able to give. The sun began to touch the horizon, painting the sky with orange tones that would soon give way to darkness. It was the time for the decisions that define a man's character. Johnny walked slowly to where Belle grazed, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The animal looked at him with its large, meek eyes, as if it understood the weight of the moment. With a simple gesture, Johnny untied the rope that attached Belle to the post and led her to the group of Indians. He said nothing. Words were unnecessary at that moment. He simply extended the rope to the leader of the group and nodded. The man looked at him with incredulity, then with a deep gratitude that transcended any language. As he watched the group walk away, taking Belle with him, Johnny felt something strange in his chest. It was neither relief nor regret. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time, something Martha used to awaken in him with her little acts of kindness. It was peace, a strange and unexpected peace, like rain in the desert. Night fell on the farm like a heavy blanket. Johnny remained on the porch long after the group of Indians disappeared over the horizon, taking Belle with him. The silence now had a different, deeper weight. It was not just the absence of sounds, but the absence of possibilities. Without the cow, with no prospects of income, he had only a few handfuls of flour and beans kept in the pantry. Inside the cabin, Johnny lit a candle and examined its provisions. There was enough food for maybe a week if I rationed carefully. After that, he would have to make even more difficult decisions. He could try to sell his own land, even though he knew that no one would be interested in a dry, unproductive piece of land. He could look for work in the nearest city, abandoning the dream he had built alongside Martha. Sleep came with difficulty that night. Johnny lay down on the creaking cot, looking through the small window at the stars that seemed infinitely far away. Martha used to say that each star represented a kind soul that had departed, still caring for those who remained. He had never believed these words, but that night, surrounded by the vastness of the desert and the uncertainty of tomorrow, he found himself wishing they were true. He woke up before dawn to a strange sound. It was not the wind, nor the familiar creaking of the wood of the house. It was something rhythmic, like distant drums. Johnny got up and went to the window, but the darkness still covered everything like a thick blanket. The sound continued, coming from somewhere undefined on the horizon. Sometimes it seemed close, other times it faded completely. When the first rays of sunlight began to clear the sky, Johnny went out to the balcony with a cup of warm water, in place of the coffee he didn't have. It was then that he saw something that made him question if he was still dreaming. On the horizon, where yesterday there was only empty land, now rose small spirals of smoke. Not one or two, but dozens of them, spread out in an irregular line that stretched beyond what his eyes could see. As the light increased, Johnny could make out the approaching silhouettes. At first they were just dark dots against the clearing sky, but they gradually turned into recognizable figures. Knights. Many knights. More than Johnny had seen gathered anywhere during his entire life in the West. His heart started beating faster. A force of that size could only spell trouble. Perhaps they were soldiers in pursuit, or organized bandits, or worse still, an Indian hunting party that had found out about their generosity the day before. Johnny knew stories of farmers who had been accused of collaborating with tribes and faced dire consequences. But as the knights approached, Johnny noticed something peculiar. They did not raise excessive dust, as would be expected from a fast-moving, hostile group. They advanced with deliberation, almost ceremonious. And there was something about the way they organized in orderly rows that suggested military discipline but not aggression. When they finally got close enough to be seen clearly, Johnny realized that his assumptions were completely wrong. They were not soldiers or bandits. They were Indians. More Indians than he had ever seen gathered. Men on horseback, painted for war, with spears and bows. But something about their posture did not convey hostility. On the contrary, there was an almost reverential solemnity in its approach. At the front of the group rode the same gray-haired man who had spoken to Johnny the day before, but now he was neither on foot nor hungry. He rode a sturdy horse and wore ornaments that clearly identified him as an important leader. Behind him, horsemen stretched out in an impressive formation that occupied the entire visible length of the plain. Johnny stood on the porch, his hands shaking slightly as he held the empty cup. There was nowhere to run, no sense in trying to hide. If those men wanted to harm him, he was completely at their mercy. But something about the leader's expression, the way he slowly dismounted and approached alone, suggested different intentions. The man stopped a few meters from the balcony and spoke, this time in much clearer English than the day before. He explained that he had returned to his tribe and told him about the unexpected generosity he had found, about a white man who, even facing his own hunger, had given his only cow to feed strangers. The story had spread rapidly among the tribes of the region, and word had reached the ears of the great chief. Johnny listened in silence as the man explained that his tribe, along with several others, had decided that such an act of kindness could not go unnoticed. That there were ancient laws, older than the laws of white men or even the laws written in books, that governed how generosity should be answered. The sun was now fully risen, bathing the whole scene in golden light. Behind the leader, more than 100 warriors stood mounted in respectful silence as if awaiting orders. Johnny felt that he was witnessing something much greater than his comprehension could encompass. Something that connected his small abandoned farm with traditions and codes that had existed for centuries on that land. The leader made a gesture with his hand, and immediately several warriors dismounted. They began to unload supplies from their mounts, tools, wood, ropes, and things Johnny couldn't identify from a distance. It was as if they had come prepared for something specific, as if they knew exactly what they intended to do before they even arrived. What Johnny witnessed in the hours that followed challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. The warriors moved with an efficiency that only comes from shared experience, as if each knew exactly what role to play without the need for words. Some made their way to the broken fences, others to the abandoned corral, and a larger group began to examine the structure of the hut itself. The leader stood beside Johnny, explaining in his mixture of English and gestures what was happening. He said that his name was Grey Eagle, and that he represented not only his own tribe, but an alliance of several others who had heard the story of Johnny's generosity. He explained that, according to the ancient traditions of his people, when someone gave everything he had to feed the hungry, that person became sacred in the eyes of the spirits, and sacred people should be cared for. Johnny watched in disbelief as the men got to work. Groups formed naturally around different tasks. Some tore down the rotten fences and began to install new ones, made of strong, well-crafted wood that they had brought with them. Others cleaned the corral, removing years of rubble and preparing the ground. A third group had begun to examine the well, testing the depth of the water and discussing something in their own language. It was like watching a complex dance, where every movement had purpose and meaning. There was no hurry, but there was no hesitation either. Each man seemed to know instinctively where his strength would be most useful. Johnny tried to offer to help, but Grey Eagle stopped him with a gentle but firm gesture. He explained that accepting Johnny's help at that moment would be an offense to traditions. This was their time to give back, not Johnny's to work. As the day progressed, the transformation of the farm became more evident. The new fences rose straight and strong, creating organized divisions where before there was only chaos. The corral was taking shape again, with solid gates and reinforced corners. But perhaps the most striking change was happening in the well. A group of men had descended to its depths and were doing something that produced regular metallic sounds. Grey Eagle noticed Johnny's curiosity and led him to the edge of the pit. He explained that his men had found an underground source that was partially blocked by debris and sediment accumulated over the years. With the right tools and traditional knowledge about groundwater, they would be able to not only clean the well, but significantly increase its flow. As they talked, other warriors approached carrying something that made Johnny blink his eyes several times to make sure he was seeing correctly. It was Belle, her cow, but she was not alone. Beside him walked 2 other cows, both visibly healthy and well cared for. Behind them, led by young Indians, came 6 more head of cattle. Grey Eagle smiled when she saw Johnny's expression. He explained that Belle had served her purpose, feeding the hungry as needed, but traditions also said that when someone gave away their last cow to save lives, the spirits would ensure that that person would never again be in need of cattle. The other cows were gifts from different tribes, each contributing what they could to honor Johnny's act. The sun was high when the last groups arrived. These brought something different: wagons loaded with seeds, growing tools, and something Johnny hadn't seen in months: prepared food. Women of the tribe had cooked bread, stews, and other foods, enough to feed all the workers and still leave supplies for Johnny for several weeks. But perhaps most surprising was what happened when one of the groups working in the cabin called Grey Eagle. Johnny followed them and found that they had found something buried under the loose floorboards. It was a small metal chest, rusty but still sealed. When Johnny opened it with trembling hands, he found inside documents and a small amount of gold coins that Martha had hidden years earlier during the prosperous times as a reserve for emergencies. Tears rolled down Johnny's hardened face as he held the papers in Martha's delicate handwriting. They were receipts for cattle sales from the first years of marriage, when the farm was thriving. There was also a letter addressed to him, with instructions to find the hiding place in case something happened to her. Martha had foreseen difficult times and tried to protect him even after she left. Grey Eagle put a hand on Johnny's shoulder and said something the farmer would never forget. He said that spirits had mysterious ways to reward those who care for others without expecting a reward. That perhaps Martha was still watching over him, guiding events so that his generosity would be recognized and reciprocated. When the sun began to tilt westward, the transformation was almost complete. The unrecognizable farm stretched out before Johnny like a dream materialized. New fences, cattle grazing peacefully, a well that gushed abundant clean water, and a reinforced hut that now seemed capable of withstanding any storm. But more impressive than the physical changes was the sensation that hung in the air. There was a different energy in that place, as if the land itself had been blessed. Johnny felt that something fundamental had changed, not only on his farm, but in himself. The loneliness that had consumed him for 3 years seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a deep connection to something greater than his own existence. The warriors began to gather again in formation, preparing to leave. Grey Eagle approached Johnny one last time and handed him something wrapped in soft leather. Inside were special seeds, varieties that grew well in arid terrain, and simple instructions on when and how to plant them. He said that if Johnny followed the guidelines, he would have enough crops not only for himself, but to share with others who might be in need. The months that followed brought Johnny a new understanding of the meaning of abundance. It wasn't just the farm that had been transformed on that extraordinary day, but her own perspective on life. The seeds that Grey Eagle had left sprouted with surprising force, creating green fields where there had previously been only dry land. The cattle thrived, fed by the abundant water from the renovated well and the pastures that Johnny cultivated following the old instructions. But the real transformation happened when Johnny realized that his story had not ended with the departure of the warriors. Word of what had happened on his farm spread throughout the region in ways he had never expected. Travelers stopped to hear the story of the farmer who had given his last cow and received a new life in return. Some came out of curiosity, others out of necessity. Johnny discovered that his farm had become a kind of refuge. Struggling families would show up on his doorstep, and he could never dismiss them without offering help. He shared his crops, offered temporary shelter, and always found ways to help without expecting anything in return. It was as if the lesson he had learned that day from Grey Eagle had become part of his nature. The most impressive thing was how his generosity seemed to multiply. Each person who helped took with them not only what Johnny had given, but also the example of what was possible when someone chose to give rather than hoard. Stories came to him about people who had been touched by his kindness and who were now helping others in their own communities. One afternoon, almost a year after the encounter with the warriors, Johnny received an unexpected visitor. A young man, clearly of indigenous origin, but dressed as a merchant, arrived at the farm driving a small cart. He explained that he was the grandson of Grey Eagle and had come to fulfill a promise made by his grandfather. The young man, who introduced himself as Samuel Aguirre Branca, said that he had studied in the schools of white men and now served as an interpreter and mediator between different communities. He said that Grey Eagle had been deeply impressed, not only by Johnny's initial generosity, but by how he had used the blessings he had received to continue helping others. Samuel brought with him a proposal. Several tribes in the region had decided to establish a formal agreement with Johnny. They wanted to turn their farm into a meeting place where people from different backgrounds could come together, exchange knowledge, and help each other. In return, they offered protection, regular supplies, and a support network that would stretch for hundreds of miles. Johnny listened to the proposal with his heart racing. It was an opportunity to make official something that had already been happening naturally. His farm had become a place where goodness flourished, where people found not only material help, but spiritual renewal. Accepting the proposal would mean committing himself permanently to this path, abandoning any possibility of returning to the solitary life he had known before. The decision was not difficult. Johnny understood that he had found his true purpose, something that Martha had always tried to show him through her small acts of charity. He accepted Samuel's proposal, and in the following weeks, witnessed a new transformation in his land. They built a larger house, capable of housing several families at the same time. They established communal camps where anyone could work and share in the harvest. They created workshops where different groups taught each other their skills. Indians teaching about medicinal plants and sustainable cultivation, settlers sharing construction techniques, and cattle raising. What impressed Johnny most was how old conflicts seemed to dissolve in that environment. People who traditionally saw each other as enemies discovered common interests when they worked side by side to help those in need. It was as if the farm had become a neutral territory, protected by the force of genuine compassion. 2 years after that transformative day, Johnny was on the porch of his new home watching the constant movement of people arriving and leaving. There were families camped near the creek that now ran permanently through the property. Children from different backgrounds played together, while their parents worked in the fields or learnt new skills in the workshops. Samuel White Eagle had become a regular visitor, bringing news of how Johnny's story continued to inspire change in far-flung communities. He told of farmers who had begun to set aside some of their crops for needy families, of merchants who offered fair prices to everyone regardless of origin, of entire communities that had adopted principles of cooperation rather than competition. That night, as Johnny walked through the fields in the moonlight, he found himself thinking about Martha. He felt his presence in a way she had never experienced before, as if she could finally rest, knowing that he had understood the most important lesson he had tried to teach her, that true wealth is not in what we possess, but in what we are able to give. The night wind carried the sound of low voices coming from the camps, people sharing stories around the campfires. It was a different sound from the deathly silence that had dominated the farm for so long. It was the sound of life being lived fully, hope being renewed, goodness multiplying. Johnny smiled as he realized that his story had become much bigger than himself. It was no longer about a lone farmer who had given away his last cow. It was about how a simple act of generosity had created waves that kept expanding, touching lives in ways I probably never fully knew. When he returned home, he found a little surprise waiting for him. One family had arrived during the night, a young couple with 3 small children, visibly exhausted and hungry. They were sleeping near the communal kitchen, enjoying the heat that still emanated from the oven. Johnny silently covered them with blankets and left fresh bread and milk within reach for when they woke up. It was a simple gesture, automatic now, but one that carried the full weight of the transformation she had experienced. He understood that this was his destiny, to be a guardian of generosity, a living example that genuine kindness always finds a way to multiply. As he prepared for bed, Johnny looked out the window once more at the earth, that now pulsated with life and purpose. I knew that the next day I would wake up to new opportunities to help, new stories of people who needed hope, new examples of how compassion can transform the world one life at a time. The farm that had once been a symbol of loss and loneliness was now a beacon of hope that shone in the heart of the desert, proving that even in the most arid places, generosity can flourish gardens of goodness that nourish not only the body, but also the soul. If this story of generosity and transformation has touched your heart, you can't miss our upcoming adventures in the American Wild West, where men and women face choices that define not only their destinies, but the character of an entire nation. Subscribe to the channel to follow more stories about courage, redemption, and the codes of honor that shaped an era, and leave your comment below telling what was the most emotional moment of this story for you. Was it when Johnny decided to donate Belle, when the 120 warriors appeared on the horizon, or when he discovered the treasure hidden by Martha?